Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Kathleen Morris. I am the Sylvia and Leonard Marx Director of Collections and Exhibitions and the Curator of Decorative Arts here at the Clark. And I'm the curator of the exhibition Wall Power Modern French Tapestry from the Mobilier National, which I'm going to talk about this morning. And first of all, I want to say a few words of thanks. I want to thank the Mobilier National, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment and what their mission is, but for generously lending all of the tapestries that are in the exhibition. I'd also like to thank the supporters of the exhibition. I think everyone is here in the audience today, George All, the Kobe Foundation, and Bob Kraus. And also not here today is Denise Littlefield-Sobel, who supported the exhibition catalog. I'm very grateful to her. I hope you've had a moment to walk through the exhibition. If you haven't, please do so after the lecture. But I'll talk a little bit about the backstory of tapestry in the 20th and 21st centuries before I really delve into the exhibition. But I do have one more word of thanks to say before I start, and that's to the Clark team. Putting tapestries on the wall is different than hanging paintings, and as you can see, it takes a village to put up a tapestry the size of the tapestries in the exhibition. But I work with an incredible team here at the Clark, and it's such a pleasure to put exhibitions together with them. So the Mobilier National has a very long history. It dates back to 1604, when it was created under King Henri IV as a royal repository of furniture belonging to the crown. So these were all of the furnishings that were used for the royal palaces and other places where the king and his court might go at the time. And over the centuries, as you can imagine, the accumulation of furniture and furnishings and carpets and textiles of various kinds, tapestries, paintings, grew and grew. And so Henry IV saw a need to sort of create an entity to oversee this. And 400 and some years later, that entity still exists under the name now Mobilier National. And this is its headquarter location in Paris, in a beautiful building that was built in 1934 by the architect Auguste Perret. And there I am, about a month ago, standing at its gates. And it has an amazing mission. So as I say, it's got an enormous collection of furniture and furnishings that it uses to furnish the public buildings of France. So the President's Palace, the General Assembly, and other buildings in and around Paris, but embassies of France around the world. Embassies and consulates around the world are decorated with furnishings and objects from their collection. That's probably their main function, and it keeps them very busy. I think they furnish about 600 buildings worldwide. But in addition, they have long had the mission to preserve ancient craft traditions in France, not just tapestry, but tapestry is one of them, but also furniture making, carpet making, lace making. They actually train artisans in these crafts and employ them in the workshops, in these historic workshops that have been in existence for centuries, that are now under the auspices of the Mobilier National, which preserves these crafts for the future and an important part of the French patrimony. They also have a mission of collaborating with artists to create new things within these workshops. And this is also a long-standing tradition. And this is what I'll be talking about today in the context of the 20th and 21st century tapestry making in collaboration with contemporary artists. Now, tapestry has a rich history, and it has a history beyond the borders of France, but I'm really focusing today on the French tradition, which in fact is one of the oldest and the most enduring, continuously making tapestries in France since the Middle Ages. French tapestry is renowned for the quality of the productions that are made by the various workshops, which I'll talk about in a moment. And as I mentioned, because of this tradition, because of the excellence of the product, because of how important they were historically to the sort of cultural identity of France, they've long been seen as a really crucial identity, a part of France's cultural identity and patrimony. Our exhibition focuses on tapestries designed between 1930 and the present, with an emphasis on the first few decades after the Second World War. And as I was working on this exhibition and delving into this history, I uncovered what I thought, I didn't uncover it, I discovered for myself, and I'm going to tell you about fascinating backstory to the tapestries that were made during and right after the Second World War in France. And there's also, I think, a really interesting US angle to this story. So before I start talking about that, I just wanted to go over quickly the places in France where tapestries have historically been made and continue to be made. And you can see a circle around Paris on this map, which is where the Gobelins manufactory is located. It has been there as workshops since the 15th century, but it was codified as a royal manufactory of tapestries and furnishings by Louis XIV in 1662. And then a little bit north of Paris, in 1664, another royal manufactory was established in the town of Beauvais. So this was also aligned under the crown, and it was established under Louis XIV. There's also, about 250 miles south of Paris, in the commune of Aubusson, this has long been the location of private ateliers weaving tapestries, going back to the Middle Ages and continuing to today. So these are the main centers of tapestry making in France. Just to talk for a second about making tapestries. Tapestry making is a really painstaking process. It's collaborative. Every tapestry starts with a design made by an artist. That design needs to be translated into a design that can be woven into fabric. So the artist design, the artists are often collaborating with the weavers to determine how this translation is going to happen. There are dyers involved who are custom dyeing the yarns for every object. And tapestries are incredibly expensive to make because they're very, very slowly made. So the amount of labor that goes into every tapestry and the materials that go into every tapestry make it inherently an expensive medium to work in. And so there always also needs to be some kind of commissioner. People are not making 14-foot wide tapestries on spec. So if you look at so here is a view of the Gobelins factory from about 10 years ago, I think, where these weavers are working on a high warp loom. A high warp loom, there's two kinds of looms. There's a loom where the warp threads, which are these up and down threads, which provide the matrix for the tapestry, are standing in front of the weaver. The weavers are sitting behind the tapestry. You see here all of their bobbins loaded with all of the colors for the design. In this instance, with the high warp loom, the cartoon, which is the life-size design that the weaver is following, is behind the weaver. So this is what they're weaving. And you say, well, how in the world can they weave it if it's behind them? But they actually have it marked onto the warp threads. You can see some lines here. And what you can't see is they can peer through the warp threads and look at mirrors, which are reflecting the design from behind them. So this is the kind of the essential components that the weavers work from, whether they're working on a high warp loom or a low warp loom. And again, on the right, these photos are both from around 1900. On the right, you see a high warp workshop in the Gobelins factory, and on the left, you see a low warp workshop in the Beauvais factory. And here, they're actually working on small looms, but the looms, the low warp looms, are horizontal to the floor, and the weavers are bending over them, again, working from behind, again, working from a cartoon, and following a design. The way that tapestries are made has not changed. So the way they're made today is the same as they were made hundreds of years ago, completely made by hand. Dyeing is also following centuries-old practices. For every tapestry, a palette of colors is chosen, and then yarn is custom dyed according to the colors that are needed. In the same way that it has been done for centuries. Here you see the dyeing workshop at the Gobelins factory where they're dyeing the yarn and hanging it to dry. They figure out how much of each color they need to weave a tapestry, and that's how much yarn they spin and dye for each color. So I spoke a minute ago about the long history of tapestry in France. And in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance period, tapestry was a really important part of interior decoration in castles and churches and so forth. And weavers at that time were weaving from designs specifically made to be woven as tapestries. So you see here these two beautiful early tapestries, both in the collection of the Cluny Museum in Paris, that have a limited pattern, limited color palette, relatively thick yarns so that there's not so many threads per centimeter, and a design that's very distinct from what you would think of as an easel or a wall painting. And for example, these overall patterned backgrounds that sort of deny any sense of illusionistic space. This approach to tapestry changed in some ways overnight with this series of tapestries that was woven in the early 16th century on order of the Pope for a series of tapestries after designs of the Acts of the Apostles designed by Raphael, woven in Brussels, and hung in the Sistine Chapel on special occasions, which they still are. So Raphael, the great Italian Renaissance painter, created full-size cartoons. Again, that's what the weavers need in order to weave their patterns. But they're like giant paintings. These are actually all, the ones that survive, I think 7 out of 10 survive, and they're on view at the Victoria and Albert in London. And on the left, you see the cartoon that Raphael designed for the tapestry on the right. Now, the tapestry on the right has faded, so the colors are not as bright and vivid as they would have originally been, but the tapestry recreates a sense of pictorial space. So it is, in essence, imitating an oil painting. And this was an incredibly successful series of tapestries, incredibly influential. And from that moment forward, tapestry was really tasked with the job of imitating oil paintings. So here you see two beautiful tapestries from the 18th century, again, sort of from the height of the popularity and the quality that was being produced by French tapestry factories. On the left, in the center of the tapestry, you see a scene from the novel Don Quixote, and on the right, you see a kind of an outdoor picnic that was designed by the great painter, Francois Boucher. So this type of tapestry had a very long and influential lifespan that went over several centuries. I mean, you found these kinds of tapestries in palaces and, manor houses, and they were civic spaces. The tapestry workshops in France continued to make tapestries like this, and they continued to make them, and they continued to copy really popular ones like the Don Quixote tapestries long after there was really a market for them. In the 19th century, tastes changed. The way people lived changed. The way people decorated buildings changed. But the tapestry industry really didn't change. So by the late 19th century, the French tapestry industry was in enormous trouble. There were a lot of painters, as you know, the late 19th century is a time of great experimentation with different styles, and the French tapestry workers who've always worked with contemporary artists and continued to do so, but they were continuing to work with contemporary artists working in illusionistic styles, like the tapestry you see on the left. And they were continuing to make tapestries to hang in places like the right, manor houses or Gilded Age mansions in America. And there was a market for these up until sort of the turn of the 20th century, when in fact that market began to decline. You can see in this picture of Shiplake Hall in Oxfordshire, sorry, let me get my pointer, this big old tapestry. Well, it might be old, or it could be a contemporary tapestry that just imitated an old pattern. And this is what the tapestry manufacturers were making, in addition to woven copies of famous paintings like the Mona Lisa. And there really was no market for this. By the beginning of the 20th century, they were making lesser and lesser quality materials because they were having a hard time selling them. And there was a sense inside the tapestry industry, as well as from critics from the outside, that the industry needed to be reformed, and that they needed to come into step with the currents of contemporary art. But there was a lot of resistance from inside the industry. So I'm showing you these weaving workshops again, and first of all, notice that at this period, all of the weavers are men. This was a very male-dominated industry at this time. The weavers were mostly men. The people who ran the factories were mostly men. The profession of weaving was incredibly prestigious. And in many cases, it was a craft that was passed down from generation to generation. And so many of these weavers had no interest in doing something different, or they couldn't see their way to figuring out what that would mean to do something different. And so for a number of decades leading up to the Second World War, there was just a kind of a doldrums in terms of the production of these workshops. But there were a lot of attempts made to revive the medium of tapestry as a vehicle for contemporary art. And it's not to say that, so there was an interest, an understanding this needed to happen, and people making attempts for this to happen, but with small results. And that's not to say that nothing like that happened, because here is a beautiful screen. It's a tapestry stretched as a screen by Raoul Dufy that was designed in 1922. But examples like this were pretty far and few between. There were certain really influential people who were working on this problem within the tapestry industry in France. And one of them is this woman, Marie Coutoli, who's a fascinating character, a central figure in rejuvenating tapestry for a new era. She was an entrepreneur and a gallerist. She ran a gallery in Paris called the Maison Mirbeau. She began commissioning artists in the 1920s in Paris to create rugs and tapestries and furniture, and working in very avant-garde styles. And she became very successful. And she was also very eager to promote these, not only in France, but also in the United States. The United States was seen as a real market that was ripe for opportunity for this kind of product. Marie Coutoli had several really successful displays in the 1925 exposition of decorative arts and modern industrial design in Paris. That's a big mouthful, but it was a really important expo that took place in Paris with products from all over the world, nations from all over the world who had displays, as these expos tended to do. And this actually was the expo that introduced the world to what we now call Art Deco. And it was incredibly influential. And a selection of this enormous exposition, selection of objects from them, was brought to America and circulated to museums around America in 1926 and 1927. And Americans began to become really interested in this new sort of decorative language of decorative arts. In fact, these kinds of displays then spawned exhibitions in museums and galleries and department stores where people could see how contemporary design could sort of translate itself into domestic living. This is a display at Lord & Taylor in New York in 1928, in which you see these are all things that were loaned by Marie Coutoli from her Maison Mirbeau. So furniture, carpets, and I think those are carpets hanging on the wall, but all woven things and furniture. Marie Coutoli really took off with this idea of creating contemporary tapestry and promoting it within the United States. So in the 1930s, she began to commission cutting-edge artists like Pablo Picasso, Ferdinand Léger, Juan Miró, Georges Braque to create tapestries and under her sort of patronage. And then she began to display these. And in 1936, there was an exhibition of these at a gallery in New York City. And it was the first time that contemporary tapestry had been shown in this country, and people were both fascinated and rather dumbfounded by these things that did not look like traditional tapestries. They weren't. Some of the critics weren't sure if they were really original works of art or were they reproductions of paintings. And in 1939, Marie Cuttoli sent another exhibition of contemporary tapestry to San Francisco. It was on view at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. And then it was not able to go back to Paris because of the war. And so from 1939 through 1945, Marie Cuttoli's exhibition of contemporary tapestries circulated in the United States. It went to 20 venues. It went all across the country. It went to major museums as well as arts clubs in cities across the country. And on the right, you see this exhibition as it was shown at the Cleveland Museum of Art in 1940. And you can see tapestries here by Ferdinand Léger and Georges Rouault. And notice how small, like these are both by Georges Rouault, and you'll see them again in a moment. They're sort of still kind of painting size. And this was one of the things that some of the critics of Cuttoli's experiment were kind of curious about, like, is this really what contemporary tapestry should look like? It also went, the same show went to the Arts Club of Chicago, as this show circulated through the United States, it became an opportunity for the American public to really connect to the French plight, because France was occupied. This is during the war. These tapestries were exiles from their country, could not go back to a country under occupation and in the grips of war. And so actually going to the exhibition became a kind of a patriotic act or a way to express solidarity with the French. And she did sell things from these exhibitions. So, for example, the Art Club of Chicago, which hosted the exhibition, bought this tapestry by Brock. She sold tapestries to private collectors like Dr. Barnes in Philadelphia, but also Helena Rubinstein. And you see those Rouault tapestries now hanging in Helena Rubinstein's apartment, along with this is also a tapestry by Picasso, framed like a painting. And we have a tapestry in the exhibition that was made under Marie Cuttoli's patronage. So this is the first tapestry I'm showing you that's actually on display. Anytime you see this little wall power thing, it means that the tapestry is on display in our galleries. This is a fascinating story, too. So Juan Miró, great painter, as we all know, and designer, was commissioned by Cuttoli to make several tapestry designs in the early 1930s. And this is one of the ones that he designed specifically to be woven into tapestry under her patronage. The original cartoon was actually a full-size painting, and I'm showing it to you here on the left. This painting is now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. It was purchased in 1952 by Nelson Rockefeller, who then gave it to MoMA in 1976. And in the early 70s, there was a big Miró exhibition that MoMA did, and they convinced Miró, who was still alive, to have some of his tapestries rewoven. And so one of the interesting things that is true about all of the tapestries in our exhibition is that they were never intended to be unique one-off things. They were always intended to be made in small editions, maybe 3 or 6. And on the labels, if you look through the show, you'll see toward the bottom of the information about the tapestry, it will say 1 of 3 examples or 2 of 4 examples. Whenever I could figure that out, I put it on the label. So this was rewoven in the 70s. But so this is done by the Gobelins factory, and they have gotten the information about all of the original colors that were used for the original tapestry so that they can recreate it faithfully. And Miró was involved in the recreation in the 70s of the new weavings. It is interesting to note that the painting in MoMA is very famous today, And most people don't realize that it was actually created to be a design for tapestry. Well, there's another really key figure in the efforts to revitalize tapestry before and during the Second World War, and that is this guy whose name is Jean Leursat. He was an artist who also worked with Marie Coutoli starting in the 1920s. He was really interested in textiles. He was designing tapestries and carpets with her. But then he sort of had an epiphany at one point that led him to become one of the people who really revolutionized French tapestry in the middle of the 20th century. In 1937, Jean Leursat went to the town of Angers, and he saw this tapestry series, which is still there. I took this picture about 2 months ago. This is a 14th century series of tapestries that is about 100 meters long now, 100 meters of tapestry that are all on view in the castle in Angers that was commissioned by the Duke of Anjou and woven in the late 1300s. So it's a very early and rare survival of medieval tapestry series. It shows scenes from the book of Revelation, and each scene shows a different story. And Leursat was struck by the simplicity of the scenes, which tell stories with a wealth of detail, but no attempt to create an illusion of real space. They have a limited palette of colors, they repeat forms and simplicity, they have blank or sometimes patterned backgrounds, but they're not trying to create a sense of illusionistic space. And in looking at this set of tapestries, Leursat, as I said, had an epiphany, and what he decided was that it was time and it was necessary for French artists to return to the principles of medieval tapestry. So I had mentioned that at this time, tapestry makers were still sort of creating woven paintings, tapestries that looked like traditional oil paintings. And in Leursat's mind, what tapestry creators and designers needed to do was to go back to the time when designs were made specifically to be woven for tapestry, with a limited number of colors. So by the 19th century, with the advent of synthetic dyes, tapestries might have 1,000 colors, whereas in the Middle Ages, they tended to have like 15 to 30 colors. Another precept that he thought was important was to have a very broad weave, so that you're not again trying to create this sort of extremely fine detail. And so he had this idea, was working at that time with tapestry manufacturers to make tapestry, and then something very synergistic happened. In 1939, the French government, and this is right around the time that the French government and the Mobilier National take over the Gobelins and Beauvais manufactories. So in the late 30s, both of those historic factories are taken over by the government in order to prevent them from going out of business because the tapestry industry was in such trouble. And so they had taken over these factories and they needed to put them to work to do something new. And so in 1939, they had Jean Leursat and two other artists, Marcel Gromer and Pierre Dubray, go to Aubusson, which is, again, 250 miles south of France, specifically with the mission to revitalize the French tapestry industry. And they were working, so this is an aerial view of the little commune of Aubusson. They were working with weavers such as Francois Tabar, who was running a very old atelier. He really wanted to work with contemporary artists. So there were weavers who were interested in doing this. And you also see a group of male weavers working on a tapestry, on a low work loom at that time. Now, this was in Aubusson, and at that time also, the Gobelins and the Beauvais factories were emptied out, and all of their looms and their artisans were moved to Aubusson as a precaution because of the war. And that was prescient because in 1940, the Beauvais tapestry factory was bombed and destroyed. And so being outside of Paris and in the southern part of France was really very helpful. Now, these guys who were working in Aubusson to revitalize the industry were also part of the French resistance. In 1943, Lursa wove this tapestry, which is in the Musée, in the Centre Pompidou in Paris. It's called Liberty, and it's based on a very famous poem by resistance poet Paul Éluard, talking about the eventual triumph of France over the Nazis, good over evil, light over dark. And all of the men who were part of the tapestry revival were part of the French resistance. And so their process or their products became themselves associated with patriotism inside France and even outside of France. It's telling that the first exhibition in Paris after the Second World War, which was held at the Museum of Modern Art in Paris, which is now the Pompidou, was of tapestry. From the Middle Ages to the contemporary moment, and this has been sort of interpreted as a statement that French culture has survived the war and will continue. So you see on the left the title page of this exhibition, which was huge. It had 400 tapestries in it. A quarter of them had been made within the few years in advance of the exhibition. And on right, you see the floor plan, and I just want to state how prominent Lursa and his tapestry revival were in this exhibition. Because one gallery was given only to Jean Lursa, which is highlighted in green on the right. One was given over to Gromer, who was another one of the tapestry guys who was sent down to Aubusson to revitalize the tapestry industry. And Marie Coutoli, by this time, had kind of been pushed aside. And her efforts were really not seen as effective as Lursa and his tapestry revival. And she is given this little room in which she has tapestries by 11 different artists, really kind of indicating that her enterprise was not seen as important as Lursa and his colleagues. So this exhibition came to the United States, and it was shown at the Metropolitan and at the Art Institute of Chicago at a slightly smaller scale, but still about a quarter of the tapestries in the show were contemporary and mostly from the tapestry revival, and it took the US by storm. And people were so excited about this contemporary art coming out of France. So on the left, you see a page, the title page from the Metropolitan's catalog, and on the right, you see people in Chicago waiting to get into the exhibition in 1948 when it opened. In New York at the Metropolitan, 140,000 people saw the show while it was on view. We have quite a few tapestries in the exhibition from the tapestry revival, and I'll just go through a few of them quickly. Jean Lursa is in the exhibition represented by two tapestries, this beautiful one called The Forest, and you can see with his precepts of the tapestry revival, he's gone back to this sense of sort of the patterning, the non-illusionistic thing. There's a lot going on in this tapestry, but there's a dog here who's looking up at some pheasants, perhaps. And then this wonderful small-scale tapestry that is kind of reminiscent of the medieval bestiary. Marcel Gromer has two tapestries in the exhibition. This incredible tapestry called Winter is part of a series of the seasons that he designed. And as you go through the exhibition, I hope you take time to really sort of look at these pieces, these objects, which this one's probably life-size. It's about the size it is on the screen. There's so much detail, and there's so many sort of hidden things within these very complicated designs. This tapestry hung in the embassy in Ottawa after the war. That's the same tapestry that's in our exhibition. Again, just reminding you that these tapestries are actually put to work by the Mobilier National in embassies around the world. This is a second tapestry by Marcel Gromer that shows woodcutters in a forest. Again, very abstract and jewel-like. I love this tapestry. It's one of my favorites in the show. And there's so much detail in it that you really can't begin to understand until you stand in front of it and really look at it. I've been looking at these pictures for over a year, and I didn't realize until we hung this tapestry that there is a big dog, in the tapestry right here. And there he is. Marc Saint-Saëns was another of the tapestry revival artists you probably haven't heard of before. He was the grandnephew of Camille Saint-Saëns, the composer. He devoted his career to designing for tapestry, and he was incredibly successful. This amazing and very large tapestry of Orpheus playing his lyre to tame the animals is one of two that's in the exhibition. And I'll talk in a minute about why some of these artists are people that you probably haven't heard of, like Jean Picard-Ledoux. We also have two tapestries by him in the exhibition, including this one, which includes quotations from a 16th century poem. Or Dom Robert, a Benedictine monk who became a tapestry designer and made these wonderful tapestries that are reminiscent of the mille fleurs, the all-over patterning of flowers tapestries of the Renaissance. And I contacted the museum. There's a Dom Robert museum in the south of France, and I contacted them, and they have the original cartoon for the tapestry that's in our show, which is this, and you can kind of barely see it, but there are little numbers written inside all of the blank spaces which tell the weavers what color to use. So and you can see this one is actually a mirror image of that, because they would cut the cartoon in strips, and it's just woven on a low warp loom, put it under the warp thread so that they're actually it becomes a mirror image when the tapestry is done. There were people who were reviving the tapestry industry and working in contemporary tapestry who were not involved with Jean Lurçat and his revival, including this woman who's really fascinating, and there's not a lot that's been published about her, Pauline Pugnus, who was making tapestries in the 1920s. Very unusual. There were very few women who were working in the tapestry field at this time. But she was not just a tapestry maker, she also designed for stained glass. And she really advocated for the creativity of women and children at this time. Also, the Mobilier National itself was making attempts to engage contemporary artists in new ways with tapestry, and they commissioned Matisse to work on a tapestry with the Mobilier National in 1946. So they approached him to make a tapestry, and he chose a painting of his that he had made a few years before, called The Lute, to turn into a tapestry. You see the tapestry there. And here are the things or two of the things anyway, that the weavers had to work from. This is the original painting, which is now in a museum in Japan. They took a plate glass negative of the painting, and Matisse blocked out. You see all where this white stuff is. Matisse has gone in and blocked out like the pattern of the carpet. Then they blow up that glass plate negative into a big photograph, and then he goes back with Conte crayon and he draws all of this additional design on it, so that in the end you have a tapestry based on a painting, but with a design that's been modified to become a tapestry. Sometimes tapestries could even be woven after an artist had passed away. Raoul Dufy, we saw a screen of his from the 1920s, so he was an artist who had worked with tapestry for a long time, and he had also worked with Marie Coutoli on tapestries. After his death, his widow was approached and asked if the Mobilier National could create several new tapestries based on his earlier designs. And she agreed to that, and this is one of the two that was done at that time. So this is also in our exhibition. If you do look at tapestries that were done during Dufy's lifetime, this one looks very similar to his other tapestries. The exhibition moves into a section about mid-century design and the increasing abstraction in tapestry beginning in the 1960s. And a really critical character in this part of the story is Le Corbusier, the great architect who was very influential in terms of mid-century architectural ideas. But what you may not know so much about in terms of Le Corbusier is his passion for tapestry and his belief that tapestry was the ideal decorative element for contemporary modern buildings with their large sort of undecorated spaces. he was really interested in tapestry because it could be take up a lot of room. They could be really large, take up a huge amount of wall space, but you can also pretty easily move them. You can take them down, roll them up, and move them somewhere else. He actually, in 1952, coined the term for tapestry, mural nomade, the nomadic wall painting. And here you see him in his studio, and this is a tapestry by Ferdinand Léger. But he also designed for tapestry himself. Starting in the 1930s with Marie Coutoli again, he was working with her, and then he continued to work on tapestry design throughout his life. He died in 1965. And here he is toward the end of his life working with a guy named Pierre Baudouin, who was working with the Mobilier National and the Gobelin factory to recruit artists, contemporary artists, to work in tapestry. And you see Le Corbusier sort of touching up the cartoon for a tapestry. And we have two by him in the exhibition. They're incredible works, and they sort of stand opposite each other in one of the galleries. This really wonderful abstract design called The Woman and the Farrier, and then another one that shows a group of musicians. At this time, in part because of the influence of Le Corbusier, you found tapestries in contemporary buildings around the globe. It became a very popular way, material to decorate buildings and other spaces, as I'll say in a moment. So on the left, you see the interior of the Seagram building shortly after it was opened, and a tapestry by Miro that had been woven for Marie Coutoli and was purchased for the Seagram building by Phyllis Lambert. And then on the right, you see a giant 35-foot wide tapestry by Juan Miro that hung in the South Tower of the World Trade Center from 1974 until it was destroyed on September 11th, 2001. Tapestries also appeared in private homes. Here is just a charming interior view of a private home in the Charred Oaks Estate area of Bethesda, Maryland, and I love the color palette of this interior with this perfectly matched tapestry on the wall. It also appeared in unexpected places. Here is an Air France Boeing 707 with a tapestry hanging in the first-class cabin around 1969. Ah, the days of air travel. Speaking of the days of air travel, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which also was responsible for the interior decoration of the World Trade Center, is responsible for the decoration of the local airports in New York City, LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark. And in the 1969, there was a new international arrivals terminal built at JFK, and it was decorated by the Port Authority with contemporary art. And I just want to show you this for a minute. This is the terminal. This is the floor plan of the terminal in 1969, and everything that's numbered on here is original work of art. They're paintings, sculptures, drawings, and everything that is highlighted is a tapestry. This was in JFK Airport, with tapestries by people like Juan Miro, Jean Arp, Sonia Delaunay, and Alexander Calder, for example. And in fact, Calder was another one of the artists who Pierre Baudouin convinced to work in tapestry. And here you see the example that's in our exhibition, in which he has been helped to envision how his sort of classic mobile sculpture forms could be translated into a planar tapestry. This was done in the early 60s and was incredibly successful and a very famous part of Calder's tapestry work, but he worked in tapestry quite a lot. So the Calder tapestry centers a big section of the exhibition that focuses on abstraction in tapestry. The abstraction really took over in French tapestry starting in the 1960s, and we have a strong group of abstract tapestries in the exhibition. For example, by the Portuguese-born artist Maria Helena Vieira da Silva, with this kind of labyrinthine network of lines. This tapestry by Jean Messagier, who was a painter who was known for these sort of like compositions that imply like forces of nature. This is called Red Flames. When I went to Paris in January of this year to meet with the Mobilier National and talk about the checklist for the show, and they brought a few tapestries out of storage to show me, and this was one of them. And it was in a storage room. It was hung up close to a wall, but it was about 8 inches away from the wall. And being a curator, I walked up and looked behind it. And I said, that's how I'm going to display it so that everyone can see the back, because this is the back of that tapestry. So we've put it in the exhibition with a hole in the wall so that you can see the back of the tapestry, which is like, we came up with all kinds of nicknames for this tapestry back when we were installing, but it's it's a very big contrast from the front, but it has a similar kind of energy. Sonia Delaunay, another one of the abstract tapestries in the exhibition, she worked with all kinds of fiber arts, but she was very involved in tapestry for much of her career, and working directly with different tapestry manufactories on translating her designs into tapestry. Beginning in the 1960s, the designs for tapestries were seldom life-size, like I showed you the Miro painting, which is the same size as the tapestry. In this case, you see on the left Sonia Delaunay's design for this tapestry, which is a gouache, which is 22 by 30 inches, basically, so much, much smaller than the tapestry. And then there's a process of translating that up, sort of extrapolating it to the right size with a cartoon that she would then touch up for the weavers to follow. Victor Vasarely also was very involved in tapestry and a real champion of creating abstraction in tapestry. This is a wonderful tapestry in his op art style where it feels like it comes out from the wall towards you. And Vasarely was also a very close friend of Sonia Delaunay, so I've hung these so they're kind of in dialogue with each other. And other tapestries in very different styles, but again, I wanted to have a real variety of what could be done in tapestry in the exhibition. So you see this very abstract tapestry by the French artist Henri, who creates a sense of depth with the sparest of means. And really, when you go into the exhibition, look closely at these woven lines. They look like pencil lines on here, but you can see them. They're extremely thin, woven stitched lines. Well, the tapestry continued to grow in popularity. In the 60s, there was an enormous amount of interest in tapestry around the world. And in 1961, an international center of ancient and modern tapestry was established in Lausanne, Switzerland. Actually, Jean Leursat was one of the founding members of this new enterprise, and they launched a biennial of tapestry. So it was called the Lausanne International Tapestry Biennial, and under Leursat's influence, in the first few iterations of the biennial, everything that was on display was a traditional tapestry. They were contemporary, but they were all woven in the traditional way. And despite the name that it was the Lausanne Tapestry Biennial, within a few iterations of the biennial, artists from other countries outside of France who were not necessarily interested in just maintaining the tradition of tapestry as a woven on a loom began working with other kinds of forms. So you see here in 1969, the tapestry on the back wall is a French traditional tapestry, and this is a weaving by Magdalena Abakanowicz, the great Polish weaver who's coming off the loom and using non-traditional materials like sisal and jute and even goat hair. And this, so there was then a real sort of explosion and a vibrancy of fiber arts throughout the 70s. And tapestry was part of it, and the French were still part of very much of this very popular exploration of fiber arts. And then tapestry fell off a cliff. In the 1980s, for a variety of reasons, and this impacted fiber arts in general as well, the interest in tapestry, the market, exhibitions, publications, it just cratered. It went down to practically nothing. And in terms of just the public interest, scholarly interest, museum interest, gallery interest, and et cetera. But even during these doldrums, and this lasted for about 20 years probably, the Mobilier National continued to support the creation of new tapestries. This is what is so great about the fact that year after year, they have supported the creation of new tapestries, about 10 to 12 tapestries per year with contemporary artists. And the exhibition closes with a section of tapestries woven from the 1980s until now, more in a figural style. The interest in tapestries began to pick up again around 2000, maybe 20 or 25 years ago, particularly in Europe, and now more and more in the United States. So the sort of interest in tapestry has rebounded. I mentioned last night at the opening, which I know not all of you were there at, that this exhibition at the Clark is the first exhibition devoted to this topic in decades. So we are part of this rebounding interest in this topic. So just a few more slides and I will be finished. So this last section of the show has some very different tapestries for you to enjoy, including this hyper-realistic tapestry, kind of photorealistic tapestry by an artist named Gerard Schlosser. He was a painter and an artist who often made these very enigmatic compositions. He would take photographs of different things, cut them out, and make collages of strange compositions that you can't really decipher. And then he would add titles that make them even harder to decipher, as with this one, which is titled, "It Smells Good." This tapestry uses 140 different colors of yarn, which is how they were able to get the extreme sort of realism of it. It also took 6 years to weave, so that's quite a commitment. A very different approach. Christophe Cousin, I love this one. This is not a bad image. This is what the tapestry looks like. So Christophe Cousin, tapestry by its very nature is a form of optical art because the different colored yarns sit next to each other. They're not blended like in an oil painting or an acrylic painting. You are making the color combination in your mind, like a digital image, where the pixels are sitting next to each other, and the more pixels there are, the sharper the image gets. And so Christophe Cousin had the idea to make a tapestry that was taken from the point of view of the loom. So the looms are all facing big windows because the tapestry weavers need a lot of light. So he's facing the window and looking out with his camera, and he took a really super pixelated picture of what was out the window, which is the garden of the Gobelins manufactory. And then he wove it, or had it woven, and he called this using the loom as a camera. So this is what the loom was looking at out the window. And the last tapestry in the exhibition is by the American artist Kiki Smith. An incredible work, very powerful, and we are the first place anywhere to show this tapestry. It's one of the most recent tapestries made by the Mobilier National. It was woven, finishing in October of 2023, so just over a year ago it was finished. Kiki Smith was approached by the Gobelins factory to work with them on a design, and she provided a design that was based on a print she had made in 2012 from a series of prints called the 7 Cs. And here's the actual print. And this looks quite large, but in fact the print is, you can see, it's 6 by 9 inches, so it's very little. And one of the things that she's interested in is how you translate from one media to another. And so you can see the way that the weavers, I'm sorry, that's very pixelated, but you can see how the way the weavers have translated her vision into tapestry. And really look at this one closely because it uses techniques that are not used anywhere else in the exhibition that the weavers at the Gobelin factory specifically designed for this tapestry to get the effects that they thought the artist was looking for. So before I end, I just want to let you know about a few public programs that we're going to be doing in conjunction with this exhibition. On January the 26th, the chief curator of the Mobilier National will come, and she'll talk much more about how contemporary tapestries are made and go into the steps and show pictures of like the weaving factories and all of that. I think that's going to be really a lot of fun. And I worked very closely with Lucille Montagne on this show, and she's really amazing. On February the 8th, we're going to have Kay Wells come and talk about women in the tapestry revival. And she's done a lot of work on this and published on this. It's really interesting stories about how women in the early part of the 20th century, like Marie Coutoli, like Pauline Pugneuse, whose tapestry I showed you, but many, many women who were instrumental in the revival of tapestry as a medium, and not just as weavers, as business people, entrepreneurs, artists, and so forth. And then finally, on March the 8th, Kiki Smith will be here, and she and I will have a conversation about her experience, not just making tapestry, but translating designs from one medium to another. So thank you. That's my introduction to the show. I hope that you enjoy the exhibition, and I've gone a little bit over time, but I'm willing to answer any questions you have. I can't see you. Does anyone have a question? That's a good question. We'll have to ask her when we asked her if she had a publicity photo she wanted us to use, and that's the one she sent. So I'll have to ask her what it is. It looks like a sculpture of a dog. I don't know. Yes. Yes, and they're blue. Well, there's another way of making tapestries that's not hand woven, that's machine woven, which has been around for a long time, actually. The jacquard method of making tapestries goes back to the 19th century with sort of mechanized punch cards, and now they're computer-driven and completely woven by machine. And that's it leads to a different look. Jacquard woven tapestries just have a different look than a hand-woven tapestry. So the tradition that I'm talking about here remains completely the traditional craft of hand weaving. But there are different ways to weave tapestries. George, did you have a question?
Do you know if there's a commercial market for collectors?
So commercial market for contemporary tapestries. Well, with my dark slide in the 1980s, that market kind of went out of existence, but it is back. So in the past, particularly 10 years, if you were to go to the winter show in New York at the end of January, you'll probably see tapestries by some of these artists. I think last year I was at the winter show and there was tapestries by Calder. I've seen tapestries by Le Corbusier. More of the mid-century. I think the market is back for the mid-century tapestries. Interestingly, the tapestries that are woven under the auspices of the Mobilier National are never for sale because they're made for France and they're made to be used in the way that the Mobilier uses tapestries. But there are other tapestry workshops. There's one in Glasgow, in Scotland. There's one in West Dean, England, and there's one in Melbourne, Australia, where contemporary artists can go and have tapestries hand-woven for commercial use. And those have actually been in existence for a long time. Lee? A carpet and a tapestry. Well, in this tradition, carpestries are piled and then cut. So underneath, so they have a matrix, that's like a crossed threads, and at every crossing there's a knot. So the tapestries, the warp is the matrix of the tapestry, and the weft, which is the part that makes the design, is non-continuous, and it just goes through the warp to follow the colors of the design. They're knotted just to keep the colors, from unraveling, but the knots don't form part of the structure of the tapestry, and the knots are essential to the structure of a carpet.
Would you please tell us a little bit about the women in the exhibit, where it went from all men doing the weaving
thank you.
to...
Yes, so in the early part of the 20th century, up to the early 20th century, as I said, the industry was very dominated by men. The weavers were virtually all men. The owners of the workshops were virtually all men, not 100%. And over the years, this has changed to the point where now the weavers are virtually all women. And it's kind of an interesting shift. I think part of that happened in truthfulness. It happened in part because the profession of weaving lost the prestige that it had in earlier times. And fiber arts in general became associated with women and femininity. Fairly or unfairly, there's just an idea that this is a woman's art form. There are men who go into the weaving schools in the Mobilier National, but most of the weavers are now women. So Kay Wells, who will be here in February, will be talking about this shift and about the women who are involved in the early part of the tapestry revival era, but also the sort of impact that women have had on tapestry industry overall. Yes. You can visit the Mobilier National, the Gobelins factory, which is right next door to the Mobilier National, has an exhibition space. That is open to the public. They do exhibitions that are drawn from the collection of the Mobilier National, and you can visit that. The Gobelins factory there is actually a large kind of open storage room at the Mobilier National. They're only open on special occasions, like during the Days of Patrimony in France. But the Mobilier National has in recent years been trying to increase the public understanding of what they do. So they're trying to increase the number of opportunities people have to actually go and see it, but they are few and far between, I'm afraid. Yes?
Considering it takes so long to make a tapestry, were the resistance tapestry makers in danger of being discovered?
Oh, that's such a great question. Remember I showed you the tapestry that Jean Lursa, so the question was, given that tapestries take so long to make, were the resistance guys who were making tapestries during the war in danger of being discovered by the Nazis? And the answer was yes. I mean, Jean Lursa was harassed by Nazi officials. He was harassed by Vichy officials. And when he was weaving this tapestry called Liberty, I mean, if he had been caught making that would have been really serious. And in fact, because it was an anti-Nazi declaration and a declaration of resistance. And while that was being woven in Aubusson, Nazi officials came to inspect the weaving workshop. And there's, as I said, it quotes this very famous resistance poem called Liberty by Paul Eluard. However, as I also mentioned, tapestries are woven from behind. So the Nazis couldn't read the poem. They had no idea what they were weaving. Because if you look at the back of a tapestry, you can't necessarily know what the front of it looks like. So they actually came into the workshop while they were weaving that tapestry and had no clue what was being woven. So, well, one more maybe.
Hi, Kathy. I wonder if you can tell if there is a parallel tradition. The Belgium tapestry is a very old tradition and maybe even older than French. And were there any crossing between the traditions, or is it the same tradition?
Well, the Belgian, yeah, so tapestry weaving in Belgium, also has a very, very old tradition. And in fact, the Beauvais tapestry manufactory that was established under Louis XIV in 1664 was created in part to compete against tapestries that were being woven in Flanders and brought across the border into Paris. So it was kind of there was a competition for the market. And continued to be a very important center for tapestry weaving. But in terms of the sort of middle 20th century, the focus of this, I'm not an expert on Belgian contemporary tapestry, but I think the focus in France was really different than in other parts of Europe. But it's a good question. I should look into that more. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.